Okay, here we are. I'm here reading The Silver Crown, continuing reading this. I did chapters 1 and 2 and 3 before, so now we're on chapter 4, Letter to Aunt Sarah, and we'll see how we go depending on how long it takes. For some of the chapters are quite short. So let's begin. Get yourself comfortable. Letter to Aunt Sarah. The clerk in the post office stamp window said, "No, miss, no writing paper, only stamped envelopes and postcards." Ellen reached into her handbag and took out her small change, which consisted of 1 quarter, 2 dimes, 2 nickels and 1 penny. She also had a $1 bill. She gave the clerk a nickel and got in return a plain yellowish stamped postcard. On the other side of the post office lobby there was a writing table with a pen held to it by a chain, but no place to sit, so Ellen wrote standing up. She wrote the address first. Miss Sarah Carroll, The Blue Hill, Oak Stables, Lexington, Kentucky. On the other side, which did not allow her very much space, she wrote, "Dear Aunt Sarah, our house burned down and I have nowhere to stay, so I am coming to the Blue Hill to see you and see where you think I ought to stay. I am hitchhiking and do not know how many days it will take, as I may have to walk, so do not worry if I do not arrive very soon." As she finished the note, Ellen, to her surprise, suddenly discovered that she was crying. She did not know why, except perhaps that writing down what had happened brought it all back again. She could not feel the tears coming, but several of them popped from her eyes and splashed, unfortunately, onto the postcard. They smudged the ink, and when she wiped them off with her hand, this made the smudges even blurrier, so that she could no longer read most of the writing at all. There was nothing to do but buy another card. When she went back to buy it, her eyes must have been still wet, for the clerk looked at her quite sharply and then said with some concern, "Is something wrong, miss?" The question almost made her start crying again, but she managed to pretend to smile instead, and she said, "No, thank you, I just need another card." And she gave him another nickel. This reduced her money to $1.46, and she still had to buy the loaf of bread. She wrote the same message over again, holding her head this time to one side so that the drops, if any, would miss it. There were none, however. She signed it "Love, Ellen," and started to mail it. Then, for some reason she did not quite understand, she took it back and added a postscript in tiny handwriting because there was hardly any room left. "P.S. I have received a silver crown for my birthday." She dropped the card through the slot marked "Out of Town." Next chapter. The Shiny Blue Car. Down 30th Avenue, a few doors, Ellen found a small grocery shop where she bought a loaf of bread. It cost 25 cents instead of 22 cents because this was not a supermarket. That left her with only $1.21. But she still had, after all, had 2 free sandwiches. Across the street from the grocery shop she saw a petrol station with a rack in front, and in the rack were rows on rows of road maps. She waited for the traffic light to change, and then, with her bread and a brown paper bag under her arm, she walked across. Parked near the map rack stood a large, shiny, dark blue car, behind the wheel of which sat a young man with a pleasant smile on his face. Ellen walked up to the rack and stood before the array of maps, looking at their titles. She remembered that on their trip to Aunt Sarah's they had used several maps, and she also remembered what they were: Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. She spotted Virginia and West Virginia immediately, both conveniently on the same map. She took one of these. Now to find Kentucky. "You look puzzled," a voice said. "I don't suppose I can help." It was the smiling young man, emerged from his shiny car and standing behind her. His voice was as happy as his face, though a rather high voice, young-sounding. "Thank you," Ellen said. "I'm trying to find a map of Kentucky, but I can't see any." "No," said the young man, scanning the map quickly. "There aren't any. That's because it's too far away. Most petrol stations only have maps of the states near them." He looked at the rack again and pulled out a map. This might help. He opened it up. Its title was Southeastern United States Interstate Highway System. "This has Kentucky on it, but it's not very big. It depends on what you need it for. Are you doing a geography lesson?" "No," Ellen said. "I need it because I'm going there." "Are you?" said the young man, his voice happier than ever. "Now that's strange. I'm from Kentucky myself. In fact, I'm on my way there now. I don't suppose you'd like a lift." He said this last very casually, as if it were really intended as a joke. But Ellen did not take it as a joke. It was instead an amazing piece of good luck. "Oh," she said, almost ready to cry again. "Could I? I was going to try to hitchhike." The young man seemed not at all surprised to find a girl of 10 planning to hitchhike so far, and all alone. But he did suddenly appear doubtful, as if he were embarrassed that an innocent joke had been taken so seriously. His smile disappeared, or almost. "I don't know," he said dubiously. "I was planning to start right now and travel all night. I'm afraid you'd get too tired." "Oh, I don't mind at all," Ellen said. I've often slept in cars." "Well," said the young man, still sounding doubtful, "I suppose you could sleep in the back seat. It's big enough, and it's empty." "Oh, please," Ellen said. "I was worried about hitchhiking because I'm not sure how you wave your thumb. If I ride with you, I don't have to do it." "That's no trick," said the young man, and he showed her how to do it, waving his hand and thumb in a proper hitchhiking arc and turning his smile up even higher. "You always want to smile when you hitchhike," he explained. At the end of the lesson, he extended the hand to her, and she shook hands with him, closing the bargain. "All right," he said, "you've got a lift." She climbed into the big blue car, into the front seat, sat down beside him, and they drove off. In her lap she held her handbag, her loaf of bread, and the 2 road maps. "I'm Arthur Gates," the young man said after a moment. "I'm a teacher. What's your name?" She said, "Ellen Carroll. I'm going to Kentucky to visit my aunt." "Kentucky is 400 miles long and 200 miles wide. What part of Kentucky does your aunt live in?" "Near Lexington," Ellen said, "near a village called Oakstable." "You're in luck," Mr. Gates said. "I go right through Lexington," and his smile grew broader than ever. In luck indeed. Half an hour earlier, Ellen had only the vaguest idea of how she would get to Blue Hill. Now she was on her way in luxury. Tomorrow she would be there. It was incredible luck. Mr. Gates drove very fast and not very skillfully, Ellen thought, so there was quite a lot of unnecessary slamming on the brakes and occasional screeching of tyres. Still, in half an hour or so, they were out of the city traffic, on the open highway. There were very few cars, and in another hour they had reached the first of the mountains. Ellen loved mountains. The way the big car swung up the highway into them made her feel as if she were flying, as you feel on a sled sometimes when you come down a steep slope and zoom up another. She loved the forest that covered them, with hardly a house anywhere. The day was beautiful and sunny, and there was just enough wind to toss the leaves and make them sparkle in the sunlight. As they went higher, they drove through long miles of pine woods. From a distance, a solid coat of green fir on the mountain's back. But up close, looking from the car window through the trees, an endless series of pillars growing up through dark, mysterious chambers with carpeted brown floors. The sight always made Helen want to get out and walk through their shadowy corridors, heading up and up until she reached the top of the mountain, the only person for miles around. Mr. Gates did not talk much. He seemed preoccupied, as if he were thinking about some private problem that had nothing to do with driving the car. He had the oddest way, every now and then, of breaking into an absolutely delighted smile, so that Ellen kept expecting him to chuckle and tell her what it was about, but he never did. At first Ellen herself thought she ought to try to make conversation, so she asked, more out of politeness than curiosity, "What kind of school do you teach in?" Mr. Gates then did a very odd thing. He jumped, almost as if he had forgotten she was there. Then he turned his head slightly, held out his right hand and said, "I'm Arthur Gates. I'm a teacher. What's your name?" This was exactly what he had said before, when they first met, and it was in precisely the same tones, as if he had memorised it. But before she could answer, Mr. Gates recovered, blinked his eyes, and his smile went away. He added quickly, "You might call it a sort of training school for boys. Well, mostly boys, but now we're beginning to get a few girls too." At this his smile returned and grew bigger and happier than ever, but he did not say anything more. There was something very strange about him, Ellen decided, but it did not really matter. Whatever he was smiling about, he was taking her to Kentucky, and at a very fast clip too. She wondered how many miles they had come. She knew there was a dial on the dashboard that showed mileage, but she could not read it from where she sat. After a while she made up a sort of mile game. Where the road was straight enough, she would pick out a landmark, a big tree, a clump of pines, a cliff, a fence, that she guessed to be a mile ahead, and when, in a minute or so, they whooshed past it, that was 1 more mile closer to the Blue Hill and Aunt Sarah. The sun sank lower in the sky, the woods grew darker and more mysterious, and Ellen began to feel sleepy. She also felt hungry again and remembered the sandwich remaining in her pocket. She also remembered to be polite. She took out the sandwich, broke it in two, and said to Mr. Gates, "Would you like half my sandwich? It's peanut butter and jam." This time Mr. Gates responded quite normally. "No, thank you," he said. "I ate just before we left. I don't plan to eat again until we're there." Well, almost normally. "Until we're there," sounded to Ellen as if he were going to Aunt Sarah's too, or at least as if they were both going to the same place, and they weren't really. What he meant, of course, must be until we get to Kentucky. She munched the sandwich. It had grown stale, the peanut butter stuck to the top of her mouth, and she realised she was quite thirsty. Whenever she had taken a trip with the family, they had always taken along a bottle of water or milk in a thermos or Cokes in an ice bucket, because somebody was always forever getting thirsty. But there was no bottle anywhere to be seen in Mr. Gates's car. In fact, it was as empty and shiny as if he had just bought it. So she finished her dry sandwich, and then suddenly she was asleep. She slept as the dark came on, as Mr. Gates turned on the headlights and the big car hurtled through the night like a bright-eyed blue beetle droning its narrow way through the miles of black trees. She came only half awake once, when Mr. Gates stopped the car at a filling station and bought petrol. She had a vague impression that he also made a telephone call. She slept in the front seat, not the back, scrunched over in the corner. She did not know how late it was, nor how long she had been asleep, when she was awakened by a loud squealing of brakes, a long and frightening screech of the tyres, and the car swung fiercely from side to side as it skidded and then stopped so abruptly that she was thrown forward and hit her head hard on the dashboard. Ahead of them, just a few inches from the headlights, a truck had run partly off the highway. It lay at an odd angle, its left rear wheels up in the air like a tilted elephant's feet, its front wheels in the ditch. The trailer's rear doors had sprung open, and there were boxes and cartons lying all over the road. The trailer itself was blocking half the highway, and they had come within a foot of crashing into it. Ellen scarcely glanced at all this. When she bumped her head, the blow made her see at first a bright flash of light. It vanished, but there still remained a softer light directly in front of her eyes, and now she saw why. She had struck her head on the button that snaps the glove compartment shut. It had fallen open, and a small light had turned on, illuminating its interior. When Mr. Gates saw this, he reached over very quickly and slammed it shut, but not before Ellen saw lying inside the compartment a pistol with a long barrel she recognised instantly, and a shimmering green hood with two eye holes staring vacantly up at her. Let's stop that chapter there. Bye bye for now.